Hey guys, it's Bree. I wanted to do this week's BooktubeSFF Babbles topic. It is basically advice that you would give to somebody who is new to SFF. And I love this topic. I love this prompt. I love basically every video I've seen that has come out from it. And I think it's a really good one. So if you are new to science fiction and fantasy, welcome. It is a heck of a ride. And I think there are some things that you should know. So first and foremost, you've already been reading science fiction and fantasy. You've been reading it since you were little. You read it in school. You read it in college if you went to college. Science fiction and fantasy is everywhere, and it doesn't always take the form of 600-page novels. Some of my favorite fantasy works are all really short, brief, to the point kind of stuff. I love Gaiman, and especially his novella, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, is a fantastic example of this. It's a short work. It's under 200 pages of very light fantasy. Le Guin is another fantastic example of some really kind of lighter on the technical side of science fiction. And for the most part, people read science fiction and fantasy in school from the time you're like an elementary school student. If you read something like Flowers for Algernon in high school, I know it was required reading at mine. That was absolutely science fiction. If you have read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that is absolutely fantasy, even though it's not always wrapped up and packaged that way. So the first thing I can say to you is don't be intimidated. You've already been doing this. I think that there are a couple of ways people get really hung up on whether or not to read science fiction and fantasy. I think the first is that there's an implication that you have to be some sort of history buff or some sort of science nerd to read science fiction and fantasy. And that's not true. There is plenty of fantasy and science fiction that engages with kind of a more typical level of knowledge. I am not always a hard science fiction kind of person. I love science fiction, but I'm not an engineer. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a biologist. I'm an editor. I do copy editing and legal drafting. So, I don't have that expertise. I don't need it. Most science fiction and fantasy is about people and relationships. There's a lot of science fiction and fantasy that is about the relationship of power in society. It's not all just like rote recitation of how many troops were in some parallel for the UK in 1529. It's not all quantum physics. It's much more about people. And the stories that really get to people that really last in science fiction are all that same kind of heartfelt stories about the relationships between us as humans, between us as people and the state, between neighbors and families. That's really what the heart of science fiction and fantasy is about, and that's why it's lasted. I think the other thing people get real caught up on is the idea that you have to read a ton of books or you have to read a huge number of pages in each book. And this is, I think of this fundamentally as like the Robert Jordan problem, right? It's like the Robert Jordan meets George R.R. Martin. Not all science fiction and fantasy is like 750-page installments into a 25-book series. I hate that. I have no time, no patience for something that's going to take more waiting than it takes to wait for like the new season of Sherlock. I'm not gonna do it. And I certainly don't have the longevity to wait for like 20 years for a series to be done. Science fiction and fantasy can be long. It really can. But there's a resurgence, I think, especially lately in the art of the novella, which is a very short form of story. generally under 200 pages. There's a lot of fantastic short work, and so you don't have to commit to that. You can absolutely read at your time and space level in a way that fits your leisure time and kind of the way you live your life. And fun fact, science fiction isn't just for like white nerd dudes who want to play D&D in like a crowded comic store. Yes, they're there, and you know, they're welcome. But there is an increasingly diverse population in science fiction and fantasy, and we're here for you. And I'm glad you're here, and welcome. Again, you've already been doing this. So if you're new to science fiction and fantasy, it's okay. You got this. If you're not new, go ahead in the comments down below and leave a favorite place to start. I really do suggest Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So leave people your suggestions, leave your comments. I'll talk to you later. Bye.